Hello, everyone. I just realized that it's been 2 weeks since I last did did an installment in my John Cale series. So apologies for that. If you're interested, it's kind of had other things to do, but at last here we go with a installment number 4. And today I'm going to look at the record, "The Academy in Peril," from 1972, which is John's second solo record, but it's the third thing he released. As you recall, last time we looked at Church of Anthrax, which was a collaboration he did with Terry Riley. So it's a second solo record, but third released after the Velvet Underground from 1972. I should say right off the start, though, that if you're looking for a place to start your journey on investigating John Cale, this may not be the place to do it, because this record is largely... Well, it is. It's a classical record. So before we get into that, let's show the record. So first the CD. Here's the CD. It was never released in Canada on CD. We had imports available. This is a US copy that I picked up at some point. Don't know the date on this. The Academy in Peril. And here is the disc itself. There's the back with all the tracks listed there. Yeah, the record itself I have shown a couple of other times. It came up for some reason. I don't know why, maybe some thread or something. But this is a vinyl copy from 1972 of the Academy in Peril. And you can see it has if you're a photographer, of course, and you're interested in transparencies, you'll see these slides here on the front and the back. And the front, of course, they are die cut. So the photographs are behind here. Now, this was designed by Andy Warhol. It even says so right here. Cover concept, Andy Warhol. Photography, Ed Thrasher. My memory of this, I believe, is that it was supposed to be black and white, but John preferred color, so it was changed to color. And if you're familiar with the Lou Reed and John Cale record songs for Drella, there's a track called A Dream. And he is speaking in Andy Warhol's voice. The narrator, in this case John Cale, talks about the fact that it would have been better to have left in black and white, but he made it in color. There are some credits on the back of here, so it has a track listing. Notably, there are 2 tracks that are recorded with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra in St. Giles Church, Cripplegate, London, produced by John Cale. There are some other notes here, and I think the other thing to note is that the first track features Ron Wood, who would later, of course, become a Rolling Stone, but that's later on. Now, the other thing is about this is that I bought this used copy years ago, and there was a promo sticker on it, but someone had stuck it, can I show, in there, so I didn't pull it off because I think it's going to fall apart if I do. But it says, Kodachrome Transparency, John Cale's The Academy in Peril, processed by Kodak. So it follows the whole Kodak thing through. And then this was released, I think, repressings didn't have the die cut, and I think later ones, like, Four Men with Beards kind of things, brought back the die cut. I think it was them. So this is weird because my copy is seems to be an American pressing, but the actual sleeve and the disc say Canada. So this is Canada on there, and the reprise labels, and it has manufactured and distributed by Kinney Music of Canada Limited. So there we go. So let's just talk about the songs and what I think of this thing. So it's funny, the title itself, Academy in Peril, it harkens back to the pre-67 John Cale experience with classical music, that he was working with some minimalist composers in the United States. And before he came to the United States, he was interested in classical music. So maybe the Academy refers to that period, academic learning, like the whole concept of learning classical music. I don't really know, but it does have a somewhat avant-garde feel to it. Now, I'm a big fan of late 20th century classical music, people like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, Gavin Bryars, Arvo Pärt, even Michael Nyman, I'm going to forget some, Gorecki, in fact. And so it will be, let me just say this, as I said, did I say it already? If you're looking for a place to start with John Cale, this may not be it, because it is an avant-garde classical record, to be fair. It doesn't have the pop rock sound of some of his other recordings, and it doesn't have the sort of aggressive, kind of discordant John Cale mayhem that you might think about. So it doesn't have any of those things. It's very different in many ways. So it's still avant-garde, though. Now let's talk about the review it got. So in All Music, a retrospective review said the predominantly instrumental release steers away from the more grotesque classical rock fusions at the time to find an unexpectedly happy and often compelling balance between the two sides. Now, I will say that I actually love this record. I think it's fantastic, but I can understand someone who is a rock fan may not love it as much as I do. So let's talk about the tracks. It starts with a track called The Philosopher, which I think is brilliant and maybe the least classical record, or least classical song on it. It features Ron Wood on slide guitar. May be a little bit proggy in some respects, and but the rest of the record doesn't really sound like that. So I think that's, if I were to choose, I'll note the best songs in here. I think that's clearly one of the best songs. It moves into a very long piece called Brahms, which I think harkens back to Brahms' style of music. It's almost 7 minutes long. It is actually a really sublime piano piece, really sophisticated. It's gentle. It's kind of awesome. Definitely classical. And if you don't like classical music, you might find it a bit boring, or you might think it's like background music, but I think it's actually great. Track 3 is called Legs Lariat, Television Central, which is, I guess, comic relief in some respects. It starts off with strings, this really gentle strings, classical introduction, and then that whole feeling is broken by what sounds like, well, it is a producer or director cutting in to say how he wants the scene to play out, which I guess is a TV show. So the refrain is "Mind your boom, John, mind your boom," things like that. So it's said in it has a funny. The guy has a funny accent. I think I'm not even sure if it's John Cale or who's saying that. I'm not really sure. It's kind of comedic, but like some songs like that, after a few times you've heard it, you may be not quite so impressed with it because it kind of tire of it. But I think it's actually quite funny, and I think it's actually worth hearing. And then the next track is The Academy in Peril, the title track, which again is a solo piano piece, much like Brahms, much like the second track on the record. And I think it works very well. It really showcases John Cale's piano finesse now, or his sophistication, his prowess perhaps. I will say though that they left off a song called Temper. There was an outtake from this record called Temper, and it appears on a later compilation, which I think is much better. I think it should have been on the record, to be honest. I think maybe they could have removed one of those tracks and put on Temper. I think it's a better track. It's funny to me to think about this, because he had the classical experience before the Velvet Underground, then he has this record, and he kind of abandoned it until he began working on film soundtracks in the late 80s and 90s. So it's funny that he circles back to it. So this record in some respects seems a little out of place. And I've always wondered if he was searching for a direction, because we had that first pop rock kind of record with Vintage Violence. Then we had that really interesting jazzy kind of fusion record called Church of Anthrax. And then we have this, which is really a classical record. So it's funny to see what he was doing. Now, in side 2, we have a brief intro, called 57 seconds, and then Days of Steam, which is 1 minute and 58 seconds. And what I would say about that is I think it's fantastic. I think it's a highlight on the record. But I think it's a little too short. It's kind of pop sounding with percussion. I think it's a gem from the record. I just wish it was longer. So Days of Steam, I think, is fantastic. Then we move into three orchestral pieces. One's called Faust, one's called The Balance, and one's called Captain Morgan's Lament, two with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. Those are straight up classical pieces. And if you put them on YouTube, you'll recognize immediately what I mean by that. Just, you might find it really generic, but it's just classical music. And the interesting thing is that maybe he needed to prove himself as a classical composer, because he wrote the music, produced it, and so it is kind of an accomplishment when you think of it that way. But and anyway, it goes on to a track called King Harry. This does have some vocals, but it's not really singing. There's a really interesting backing track to it, and I've heard other people say this is like the moment of Frank Zappa on the record, or Captain Beefheart. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it is an interesting track. And then John Milton is the final track with strings and piano. So I may have said this already, but for me the best tracks are The Philosopher, King Harry, Days of Steam, and it will give a sort of nod to Leg's Larry, because I think it's kind of interesting. And I guess I wish that they had kept temper on the record instead of leaving it off. So yeah, I just wondered if he's looking for direction. It's a minimal avant-garde classical record. Not really much here for the pop music fans, I would say. But if you're into classical music, you might like this effort. And so my verdict on this one, I would say if you are a fan of classical music, especially 20th century classical music, I would give it a recommendation. I would say recommended. But if you're not, I'm going to say this is optional. My ranking below that would be not recommended, and I wouldn't go that far because I think it's actually a really great record. I would say optional. If you are John Cale, if you find that you love John Cale, you will have to eventually come back and listen to this record. But if you're looking for more pop or rock sounds, I would say this is optional, right? So that's my verdict, and I don't know if I've said this before, but I don't consider myself to be any kind of a John Cale specialist, and I didn't even look at the biography of his to review what he wrote about this. I don't remember what he wrote about this, but I think it's kind of a precursor to the soundtrack work he did later on. I think it's really effective. And that's really it for today. And I will say that the next record we'll talk about is a stone cold masterpiece. So you might want to check that out whenever it shows up. Thanks once again for watching. I'll talk to you later.